In this lesson, we'll learn how to use the Paint Bucket tool to fill areas inside our Photoshop files. Okay, great. Let's just say that we've got this saline on our screen here, and maybe this is a render that we worked in our primary 3D application on and spent quite a bit of time getting the lighting and the materials just right, so we produced this particular result. Now, at some point, let's just say that maybe it comes up that we actually need to change the color of the car. Well, rather than jump into our primary 3D application, we can actually do that way quicker here inside of Photoshop. So the Paint Bucket tool is the tool we'll be learning about in this lesson. It's right over here. If you don't see that, it's actually nested underneath the Gradient tool, which we'll be learning about in the next lesson. So the Paint Bucket tool, you'll see the keyboard shortcut for that is G. Again, you can hold down Shift and hit G to cycle through all those tools in there. And it puts a little fill bucket, a little paint bucket right next to my cursor. So this tool is going to work pretty much probably like you think it will. So right now I have this color layer selected. You can see that right here up in the control panel, what it's going to fill with is currently set to my foreground color. So if I click on that color layer, you can see that because my foreground color is set to black, it's going to fill with that color. Now, let me just go ahead and hit Control A to select all, and I'll just delete everything on that layer. Control D to deselect. We could actually come over here, and instead of filling with our foreground color, we could come over here and fill with a pattern as well. So inside this little drop down that now is available to us to the right, you can see we can select a number of patterns from the default pattern library. And we could always come in inside this little gear button, and we could come in and load a different pattern library if we want. Maybe we want a rock pattern. We could say OK to that, and then we have a bunch of rock patterns we could fill with. Now again, if we ever want to get back to that, we just need to come over and reset our patterns, just like so, and we're back to the default pattern library. Now at this point, I'm actually going to switch that back to my foreground color. I'm going to go ahead and click on my color layer again, because the cool thing about the Paint Bucket tool is that we can start to combine this tool with selections. So let's just come up here and grab our marquee tool, our marquee selection tool. We'll just draw a selection here. And if we come back over here to our Paint Bucket, and I'll hit the X key so it switches my background and foreground colors, I can just come in and I can click inside that selection, and you can see that it is now limited by that selection that I've made. So we could come in and switch that back and fill that back with black if we'd like, and we can come up to select and just choose deselect. So you can see here that using the selections that are at our disposal here inside of Photoshop can greatly sort of extend the functionality of the Paint Bucket tool. Now, really quickly, let me just go ahead and switch back to white as my foreground, and I want to just draw this in. Not only can we fill with the Paint Bucket tool, we can actually come up and, as we've seen in a previous lesson, go to Edit and choose Fill. And this is going to bring up our fill dialog. Now, you want to basically tell Photoshop what we're going to be filling with. We're not going to fill with content aware, but we can come in and either choose our foreground color, our background color, or choose a color right here inside the fill dialog with our color picker. So let's just go ahead and choose our foreground color for right now. We'll say OK on that. And we've, again, filled with our foreground color. Now, I'm going to actually show you something that's actually pretty cool, because there's a keyboard shortcut for filling with your background and foreground colors. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and hit Control and Backspace, and that's going to fill with my background color, which is black. So you can see it fills that selection with black. If I were to hit Alt and Backspace, we're filling with our foreground color. All right, great. So I'll Control Backspace again. Actually, let me just Control A to select all and delete everything on that layer again. So back with our Paint Bucket tool. Over to the right inside the control panel, the next option here is the blend mode. Now, if we weren't working on this color layer, if we were just wanting to work strictly on this background layer to color our saline here, so let's just say we come up and choose a color. Maybe we want to go with sort of a deep blue color, something like that. We could come in here and begin to click around, but you can see here that basically by doing that, it's obliterating all of the reflections and all the shadows and highlights, and basically using flat color to color our Mustang, or rather our saline. So let's just hit Control Z to undo that. We could actually come in here and choose a blend mode, so that maybe in this case we use something like color. And you can see now when I click on the saline, it actually takes into account the luminance values, the blacks and the whites and everything in between, and only changes the color of the pixels, not the luminance. So again, in this case, it's a destructive way to work. So let's go ahead and think about another way that we might be able to accomplish the same thing using a non-destructive workflow. Well, we'll go ahead and switch our blend mode back to normal and jump over here to our color layer. And that's where maybe this option right here comes into play. So if we were to select this particular option and instead change the blend mode of this new layer to color, just like so, we can get the exact same result. So I'm just going to go ahead and click on that door right there. And you can see here, it looks exactly the same. Now, there are other options here. The opacity is going to affect the opacity that we're filling with. And in this case, we want to go ahead and fill that with 100% opacity. Now, the tolerance, on the other hand, let me just undo that fill. The tolerance, look at this like the sensitivity of this paint bucket. So with a lower tolerance, if I were to drop that down to something like 25 and click, you can see that it really limits the area that's going to be filled here. Whereas a higher tolerance, we'll just undo that one and come in and click that. You can see with a tolerance of 124, not only are we filling the car, but we're also picking up on the background as well. So finding the right tolerance is often a very important part of successful filling with the paint bucket. Now there's other options here as well. You can see I have anti-alias selected here. Anti-alias just simply means instead of giving us a stair-step pattern where there are pixels, let me just kind of zoom in to where we can see some of these pixels. And you can kind of see this stair-step pattern that's happening as these colors slowly change. Photoshop will try and actually sort of soften those edges a little bit in areas. Now, because of the sharp, crisp highlights and shadows and reflections on this car, we may not see a lot of anti-aliasing in this example. But that's exactly what anti-aliasing does. It tries to soften the edges by incorporating transparency into them. Now, this second option here for contiguous, let me just undo that again here. And this is kind of important. This limits the area that gets filled to only areas that are touching in our image. So if I were to ramp this tolerance all the way down to something low, like around 25, and uncheck contiguous, and I click right here, you can see that it's starting to pick up areas that are not necessarily connected to this area that I clicked. Whereas if I were to mark contiguous and we just click on that area, it's going to limit the area that's filled to only pixels that actually touch. So in this case, again, we probably want to just kind of work with a varying degree of tolerances. So you can see that one is way too high, so we'll come down here. And you can see that not only can we just manually input a value into that box, but we can actually tap on the word tolerance and drag left and right and increase and decrease the tolerance that way. So we'll just come in here and click on a few of these other areas. And you can see here, it's a little bit picky in some of these areas where the values are very similar to maybe values that we don't want filled that are nearby. So, all right, great. So in this lesson, we've learned how to use the Paint Bucket tool here inside of Photoshop. Again, this tool seems pretty cut and dry in terms of it fills areas with color, but there is a lot of additional functionality that's built into this tool through the use of both patterns as well as blend modes. So let's go ahead at this point and we'll move on to the next lesson. In the next lesson, we'll begin learning how we can use and customize gradients here inside of Photoshop.